welcome everybody to tonight's session. We hope you've all enjoyed the conference so far. So tonight's session is nutrition and fueling solutions for racing with Lucy Wainwright. Just a few short introductions from me. I'm Ellie Gawley, I'm the Coach Development Coordinator for British Triathlon. And before I introduce Lucy to you, I'll just run you through a few of the house rules that you should be able to see on screen. So this is just to make the session enjoyable for everybody. So please keep your mics on mute so that we can hear the speaker. Use the chat box function to ask any questions you may have, and we'll pick these up at the end. There is going to be a slight interactive session halfway through, so we'll give you the nod when that is. Create your own learning environment, find a suitable place so you can engage and enjoy the session. If you have low bandwidth, feel free to turn off your webcam. For health and safety reasons, please do not walk, drive, swim, bike or run while attending the conference. Mind your language, swearing and offensive language will not be accepted, and we will remove you and put you back into the waiting room, so just be polite. All sessions will be recorded, so please turn off your camera if you are uncomfortable with this. And finally, let's get trending. So please feel free to use the hashtag Big Reboot to share your experience on social media. Right, and I will just give you a brief intro into Lucy before we head on to the session. So Lucy is the Senior Performance Nutritionist working for the English Institute of Sport with British Triathlon. Lucy's current role involves working with both the Olympic and Paralympic programmes to provide nutritional support and innovation. Lucy has been involved in the elite sport for over 20 years as an athlete and practitioner, which provides a great level of understanding of the performance environment. And on that note, I will hand you over to Lucy. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Ellie. Yeah, and welcome to the session. And yeah, thanks for having me along this evening. I hope everyone's still awake and ready to take in a little bit more at the end of the day. So yeah, I guess what I wanted to share with you today is just for a lot of us, it's been a long time since there's been any racing, and just an opportunity to reflect, to reassess, to think about kind of areas where you might be able to improve for yourself, for the athletes that you coach, and just a time just to think about times ahead, and hopefully a reintroduction of racing and an opportunity to learn and develop and try maybe some new areas and some new aspects of your race nutrition plans. So in terms of this evening, what we're looking to cover is kind of starting off with just a little bit of why it's important, and then moving on to kind of the aspects that you should consider when thinking about race nutrition, and also then when and kind of the first stages and the refinement of planning your race nutrition strategy. We'll then move on and look at more of the specifics around what that leads to. So kind of, in my opinion, it's not just about race day itself, it's about the days leading into a race and actually arriving on the start line in a really good place. It's then looking at your pre-race nutrition. We'll obviously then spend a bit of time focusing on kind of during the race and what that looks like, and then kind of finish on kind of recovery and reflection, which is often the forgotten part, but really important from a race perspective, but really important also from learning and developing for yourself and for the athletes that you're working with, to actually have that time to reflect and review. And that's the time that you can really consider how you can move forwards and what you can do differently as you go. So I'll try and blend a mixture of kind of the science that we have behind some of these things, the practicalities of it, and then experience of what I've seen in the field of some of the things that work really well, and then some of the things that are maybe a little bit more challenging for athletes. So why is it important? So the main reason obviously is that we want to make sure that the race nutrition isn't limiting anybody. So it's enabling athletes to achieve their best, and it's enabling them to get the best out of any races that they're looking to do. Poor race nutrition can mean athletes can underperform, and there's many aspects that can happen if athletes don't get race nutrition strategies right. And there's various kind of consequences to that. Obviously, it can lead to a reduction in power output on the bike. There can be a decrease in run speed if maybe race nutrition and pre-race nutrition hasn't been able to ensure that they've got sufficient fuel. So by the time they're coming to the end of racing, then that can be an issue in terms of actually them being able to sustain the race speeds that they would normally do in training. And obviously that's really critical when you're coming to those final stages within a race. There's also a lot of research to show that actually if your fueling isn't good going into it, that actually there's a higher perceived effort, which can obviously then have an impact from a performance perspective. Dehydration, so we're not just talking about fueling, we're talking about hydration and fueling and all aspects of that. And we know that there's a lot of literature out there, and I'm sure most of you have heard of all the literature in terms of kind of the potential that as little as a 2% decrease in body weight can have an impact on performance. And we certainly see that those athletes that have high sweat losses and are more prone to dehydration, that if that isn't accounted for within strategies both pre and during racing, that can have an impact on race performance. And also we need to remember that carbohydrate and fueling is also linked to our cognitive function. So athletes that maybe haven't got race fueling right, not only can it have a physiological response, but also a cognitive aspect to it in terms of poor decision making around racing. And we know that those decision making aspects of triathlon are critical in terms of that whole complete performance. So there's many aspects that both fueling and hydration will link to in terms of getting the best performance for an athlete. So if we consider that, okay, and hopefully we're in agreement, and hopefully we're here on this session because we feel that race nutrition is important and that it can have an impact on performance, kind of what are the key aspects to consider? Well, obviously the distance that you're racing, and we may have a wide range of people on the call, from people that are doing kind of super sprints and sprint distance triathlons up to those that are doing Ironman and beyond in terms of the ultra distance events. So hopefully this evening will cover aspects through all of that timeline. But yeah, really considering obviously the race distance and then the race time that it's going to take athletes to complete that distance is important when we're looking at actually what the fueling strategy is going to be. The time of day may seem like a bit of one that may not affect it, but we see a lot that athletes are often more comfortable racing in the morning. Afternoon races can be more of a challenge in terms of there's more time in the day to need to fuel. There's kind of more opportunities in terms of how much fueling needs to be had in the day, and getting that balance right between over fueling, under fueling, and just getting it absolutely right in terms of then delivery during the race. So time of day can be really important, and something to work with athletes on to ensure that they can race any time of the day and they don't get it set in their mind that they can only race in the morning, and if they race in the evening it can be a challenge. And I guess some reflections on that are also considering the time of day when athletes do their key kind of high intensity or kind of delivery sessions, and making sure that you challenge them on when they do those, so that they're starting to challenge actually what can they eat if they've got a track session or a hard interval run session in the afternoon or the evening, and not necessarily always putting it at the time that they prefer, because that will help them to kind of develop strategies which then can link into racing. And hopefully if there's one thing that comes out of this kind of presentation and thoughts tonight, then it's that actually the more that athletes can practice and be comfortable with what they're doing as part of their race nutrition plan, the more it's likely to be successful and to be a long-term strategy that sticks with them. The other one is environmental conditions. Obviously the temperature and humidity will play a big part in terms of things like sweat losses, looking at fueling plans, looking at what athletes are going to use on the bike and on the run. And that's formed a massive part of my work currently in terms of preparing athletes for upcoming Tokyo Games, in terms of the extreme temperatures and humidity that we're looking at there. So certainly environment can play a big impact, and something that it's worth considering in terms of where your athletes are likely to compete, but also the time of day will then impact what those environmental conditions are. If you're traveling, then whether that be traveling to different parts of the UK or whether that be international travel, then there's obviously aspects to consider there in terms of availability of food, time zones, flight travel, travel days, and how that all fits into the recovery and the race preparation, and how the food and nutrition will link into that component as well. And then the other one is probably just thinking about what's the target of the race. So for some people, different races will have different goals attached to them and will be different priorities in terms of what they need to consider. So just thinking about how important the race is, whether there's going to be a big taper leading into it, and how nutrition will fit into that process. So I guess as we go through, they're just some of the things to consider in terms of developing your race plans. When to start planning? I'd say as early as possible. Practicing race strategies is critical, and that's where you see the best results, and that's where you see the athletes that can then nail their race strategy, race nutrition strategy, race after race, are the ones that have practiced it. They use those strategies within training, and therefore it almost becomes second nature. Individuals do respond differently, so it's really important to find what works for each individual. And that's another key take home, I guess, from this session, that there's a lot of science out there and there's a lot of information, but it's also really key to find out what works for your athletes and what works for you if you're competing, because it is about taking the information but then applying it to your own circumstances. Training the gut, which some of you may have heard of, some of you may not, again, is a really important consideration. And when we come on to kind of the fueling aspect, I will cover that in a little bit more detail. But we know that GI, gastric, gut issues are common among endurance athletes. And therefore, there is quite a lot that we can do around training the gut, just as we would train in terms of swim, bike, run. Training the gut is also a component that can play a big part in terms of reducing some of those gut issues, reducing any kind of gastric symptoms that athletes might have around racing, which we know can be common and can limit performance in certain athletes. So we will cover that a little bit as we go through. And obviously that tends to be more common with the longer distance events, but can also occur in shorter events for some individuals as well. And then the other one is just to plan in how you're going to explore different strategies, where it might fit in training. And then really important to practice it under pressure. So not just using what you might use in a race on a kind of easy aerobic ride or a really steady run, but actually using it when you've got higher intensity intervals, when you're doing a brick session, when you're doing kind of your chain gang sessions on your bike or whatever it might be with your athletes. Like, it's really important to put it in then, because that's when it's really going to make the difference in terms of practice. So I guess there's different levels of race nutrition planning. And to me, the anchor is those fundamentals of race nutrition. And that's probably the bulk of what we're going to cover in the time scale that we've got tonight. So we're just going to look at, okay, what are the real fundamentals that you can work on to get right and get the bulk of that benefit from. There's then the really event specific strategies. So at the moment, that's a lot of what we're looking at with the Olympic and Paralympic teams in terms of real Tokyo specific. So those event specific might be around the environment. They might be around a specific course that you know is either particularly hilly, particularly flat, particularly technical. And all that might just mean that you need to make adjustments in terms of how you're going to fuel, when you're going to fuel, and what you're going to use. And then there's kind of the 1%ers or the extras on the top. And probably within the time frame we have tonight, there's probably not as much time to cover off all of those, but that might be things more like your caffeine, your nitrates, your buffering, all the additional supplements that you could then start to look at if you've got all your fundamentals in place from a performance perspective. So I guess the bits that we're going to kind of move into now is looking at kind of what would you do pre-race, and kind of what would you need to consider within aspects of pre-race around the kind of the length of race and the conditions and how you're going to manage that. Then we'll spend a bit of time looking at kind of during racing, and what's the current thinking around that and how much you need to take on board. And then finally think about kind of recovery and what that means. So some people will think of their kind of race nutrition plan as literally being during the race. I would say it starts a lot further back than that. And the days leading into a race are particularly important. So if we consider what the goal is during this time, the goal in those days leading into the race is to recover from the training block that they're just finishing. And then to kind of, if they're having a taper, however long that might be, depending on the importance of the race, then looking to arrive at race day hydrated and well fueled, to be ready to go. So there's a couple of elements to consider in terms of what these days leading into a race are really important for. How much and what should you do during that time frame? It's difficult to kind of real nail down for every individual and for every circumstance what that might be. And it comes down to looking at a few key aspects of what that looks like. So it is massively dependent on the length of the race. Obviously, if you're doing a super sprint as your race distance, then there's going to be less of a demand to look at kind of truly optimizing carbohydrate intake, any kind of carbohydrate loading and that kind of thing. Whereas if you're looking at a 70.3 or an Ironman, then definitely paying more attention to those aspects of kind of how much carbohydrate intake you need in those days leading into the race, and nailing down the different types that you can use is going to be far more critical in terms of what you're actually preparing for. So really considering that. Many of you will probably have heard of kind of carbohydrate loading. The old school way of carbohydrate loading in terms of doing really depletive exercise, and then doing a really big carbohydrate load are generally not commonplace anymore. And there's more of a general approach that as you go through a taper into some of those bigger competitions, your training volume will generally decrease. And then it's just about trying to maintain your carbohydrate intakes through that time period. Because if you think around it like that, your carbohydrate availability is then going to be much higher because you're not actually doing as much training, but you're taking in, the way I often look at it is thinking those last few days into a race, you're probably looking to fuel similar to you would fuel a big training day. So in terms of numbers, you'd probably be thinking somewhere around the 8 to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram body weight, but you're not doing the same volume of training. Therefore, there's an opportunity for liver and muscle glycogen stores to be replenished, and to ensure that you arrive at race day with those stores replenished. So there is value in doing that, but it's key to think about what you're preparing for. Similarly, looking at kind of hydration and electrolyte intakes are important. You want to make sure that in those days leading into the race that you maintain good hydration. So you're drinking regularly through the day, that you're having fluids with meals, so that you're really optimizing hydration through that time period. But if you are preparing, particularly for the longer distance events, or you're preparing for something in the heat, that you're also considering kind of your electrolyte balance through that. Because the danger is that people suddenly take on a lot more water through that time period and actually can dilute electrolyte balances through that time period, and therefore not necessarily start the race in the best shape possible. So it is, again, it comes down to the individual, comes down to what you're preparing for, but having a consideration of what electrolyte intakes, like whether that's using some of the electrolyte tabs, hydro tabs. It can also be as simple as adding a bit of additional sodium, salt to meals and things like that, if you are needing to replenish slightly more from that perspective. So it's also really important during that time to focus on a really good quality diet, and that might sound pretty basic, but it generally stands you in really good stead in terms of being able to recover really well, to make sure that you're ticking off everything, not only from a carbohydrate perspective, but that you're getting regular protein in, to make sure that you're recovering in that aspect and that muscle repair is at its best. And also looking at making sure that you've got sufficient kind of fresh fruit, vegetables, and just doing everything you can to be in a really good place by race day. And also what you don't want to do in that time period is to be compromised and pick up any illness at that time. So making sure that diet quality, making sure that any sessions you do, you're recovering really well, can just mean that you're actually putting yourself in the best place possible by the time you come to race day. We will then cover, but adapting the diet in the final couple of days for some of the longer duration races, or if you are struggling in terms of kind of stomach issues, you may need to adapt the diet slightly in terms of some of the foods that we know may cause more challenges on race day if they're eaten in those final days leading into a race. So we'll come on to it, but things like reducing the amount of fiber in the diet, and for some people reducing the amount of dairy. Now that's not something that you would want to do long term, but for some athletes, decreasing fiber and decreasing dairy in those final kind of day, 2 days before a race can have a benefit in terms of then any kind of gut issues during the race itself. So if you or people that you work with have that, then that's also something to consider. So then if we think about moving on to pre-race nutrition, so now we are really talking about the day of the race. And obviously how much they're going to have as pre-race nutrition and on that day will massively depend on the time of the race. And the main focus of that is to top up kind of glycogen stores in terms of that initial kind of pre-race aspect. But what we do want to avoid, both in kind of, I guess, the day before and pre-race, is that athletes aren't suddenly trying to eat massive quantities of foods and therefore starting the race feeling really uncomfortable. And that's why it's really important to get the couple of days leading into a race right, so that you're not just trying to pile in the carbs if you're racing a longer distance race the night before. Sometimes you see that people are actually overeating in that kind of nighttime and morning of. So keep pre-race meals simple and repeatable. So don't try and not to have something that's really obscure or that you can only have if you're based at home, because quite often you won't be based at home in terms of that pre-race meal. So yeah, trying to keep it simple, trying to have something that you can travel with, and certainly for the athletes that I work with, making sure that they can almost travel with whatever they want for breakfast makes it much easier to make sure that wherever they are in the world, they can have the same kinds of things that they would have if they were back home. And I guess one thing just to consider is that pre-race nerves can affect fueling and can affect the gut. So the gut is sensitive in terms of stress, and the increase in kind of nerves from racing and the impact on the gut is really real. So it's worth speaking to athletes around if that is affecting them. And often if that is the case, then reducing fiber and things the day before can help that. I know from personal experience that eating breakfast on race day was probably the worst meal ever, and seemed to take about an hour to eat whatever it was. So yeah, definitely understanding that that can have an impact and choosing something that you can kind of get down almost whatever is really important, as well as knowing that it's got in it what you need it to have. So what's the kind of guidance on that kind of pre-race time? We're probably aiming for between kind of 1 to 2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram body weight. So if you're a 60 kg athlete, you're talking around 60 to 120 grams of carbohydrate, aiming for it to be kind of simple carbohydrate foods. You are looking at this one probably to be lower fiber. Obviously hydration is important, so making sure that you've got fluids in as part of that pre-race nutrition. Generally you'd probably go around 3 hours pre-race. There are some super early race starts though. If you can manage it and you've got a super early start, then some people can push that back to slightly closer to racing. But for most people, generally around 3 hours seems to work pretty well in terms of the bigger pre-race meal. Then often athletes will top up that kind of pre-race meal with either using some kind of a sports drink while they're doing final preparations, or taking a gel in that kind of final time, potentially after their warm-up pre-race. So just topping up fuel sources during that time. And again, that's something that needs to be practiced. Some athletes are susceptible to that, and it doesn't work for them. But then a lot of athletes, that does work as that final top up from a fueling perspective. So things that are fairly common from a kind of pre-race breakfast perspective, or to be honest, a lot of athletes will have a similar meal regardless of time. So they'll have a plan that works 3 hours back from race start, and almost it doesn't matter what time that start is, they'll still use the same kind of foods in that kind of 3 hours out time, and will then just adjust the rest of the day to ensure that that kind of 3 hour time can stay the same. So things like porridge is fairly common. You might do an overnight oats. You might want to avoid dairy in that, and therefore use, say, an almond milk or something. You might do kind of bagels. Rice is a pretty common option that a lot of athletes would use as well. So what I'm just going to do now, just to check that at this time in the evening we haven't all gone to sleep, is I'm going to give you 3 pre-race meal options. So A, B, and C. We're looking at a 60 kilogram athlete, so they're going to try and take in around 90 grams of carbohydrate. And what I want you to do in the chat is to put down whether you think meal A, B, C, or could be 1, 2, or 3 of those would contain around 90 grams of carbohydrate within that meal. So the first one we've got is a porridge option, made with half a cup of oats, banana, peanut butter, and milk. The second B that we've got is a bagel with peanut butter and then some cornflakes with some milk. And then C is your Uncle Ben's rice with some cooked chicken and a banana. Okay, so I'll just give you a minute just to think about that. So you're trying to pick out whether A, B, and C, or any number of those, would contain 90 grams of carbohydrate. And then Ellie, if you could feed back to me a general consensus, we can see where people are. Oh, I can see the chat numbers going up. So we've obviously got some voting going on. We've still got some people awake, which is good. Oh, I can't hear you, Ellie. I don't know if you're talking.
I think they're still coming through.
Ah, cool. Okay, perfect. Have we got a general, is there a general consensus?
Yeah, there's a lot of ACs, all 3. Quite a common one. A's A, all of the above, A, B, and C, all of them, yeah. So
okay, perfect, cool, good. Well, thanks for having a go at that. I guess just to give you the outcome of that. So actually A, in those quantities, would only give you around 54 grams. B would give you around 90 grams, and C would give you around 90 grams. So the 2 that would give you that amount would be B and C. So yeah, good for having a real good think about that. I guess just to give you an idea, to make A up to 90 grams, we'd basically just be looking to increase the portion size of the oats, increase the size of the banana, and then if you add kind of a tablespoon of honey, it's a good way of adding some additional carbs without making it too bulky. So that's the other thing with the pre-race nutrition meals, is trying not to make it too heavy, but to make sure that they've got sufficient in there in terms of carbohydrate content. So hopefully that gives you an idea, because a lot of time people might talk in numbers about kind of grams of carbohydrate and this, that, and the other, but it's really important to ensure that you have an understanding, and your athletes know kind of what that would look like in real food, and how to kind of transfer that across. So yeah, really good on that stuff. So yeah, as I said before, like in terms of pre-race foods, a lot of those options in the green box are kind of really common options. Like athletes will make kind of rice porridge up using rice, almond milk, bananas, honey, because they find that's a really easy way. It's low fiber and that sort of things. Things that you want to avoid pre-race and probably the day before are things like higher fat options, higher fiber options. For some people, dairy can be more of a problem, and things like spicy options and kind of beans, pulses, any kind of the gaseous type foods. So yeah, that's just some things to think about when you're planning what those meals kind of day before and day of the race might include. So if we now move on to thinking about during the race, obviously we've already covered that during the race, it's going to depend on race distance. And we're going to need to think about during the race in terms of carbohydrate intake, fluid intake, and then electrolyte intakes. Now, these are just some kind of ballpark figures in terms of what kind of figures would you be looking at. But as we said earlier, like it's very individual in terms of how much athletes can cope with during a race and what works best for each athlete. So if you're doing a sprint distance triathlon, some people won't take any fueling at all. For some people, they will use kind of up to kind of 30 grams. So that might be a single gel, tend to be between kind of 20, 30 grams of carbohydrate. It might be 500 ml sports drink, not made up too strong. So that then again, you're getting that kind of 30 grams of carbohydrate. So not as much fuel required, obviously, in terms of the duration of those events. As we move up to Olympic distance, we're looking at more like 60 grams of carbohydrate, which tends to be consumed on the bike. Some athletes will use a gel on the run if they need to. And again, that 60 grams can be split between gels, can be within the drinks. And the fluid intakes will massively depend on the conditions and on the individual sweat responses. So we do quite a bit of work looking at sweat losses and how much athletes are sweating during sessions, and therefore looking at what fluid intakes are required, because some dehydration during the event is absolutely fine and actually means that they will finish the race slightly lighter than they started, which has some benefit on the run. But obviously there's a fine balance between that and then being overly dehydrated and that then impacting on performance. So certainly the hydration aspect is very individual. When we move up to the longer distance events, so your 70.3s, you're anything between kind of 60 to 90 grams per hour of carbohydrate. And usually there's a higher intake of carbohydrate on the bike, and then a lower intake of carbohydrate on the run. And again, the fluid intakes are rough intakes depending on the event that you're racing in. And similarly, when you move up to Ironman, you're looking at similar intakes per hour. So obviously over the duration, that's going to be much higher. And there certainly it's worth considering what you can tolerate and what athletes can tolerate during those events as well. So the key bit that we talked about earlier on was that there's this aspect of training the gut. And if we're looking at some of those higher intakes, even from, I'd say, probably Olympic distance onwards, there is an element that training the gut supports being able to tolerate fueling during a race better. And a lot of it is around what you're doing in training. So you can see at the bottom that just increasing carbohydrate content of the diet doesn't have a big impact in terms of kind of training the gut aspect. So it's around trying to train where you've got higher volumes of fluid that the stomach's trying to cope with, and therefore that helping to reduce the bloating aspects to increase gastric emptying. And that increased gastric emptying is one of the key aspects in terms of carbohydrate oxidation and also then reducing any gastrointestinal symptoms. Getting athletes used to training after a meal, getting them used to training with relatively high carbohydrate intake during sessions. So talking about doing that during higher intensity exercise and simulating that race plan as well. So we're looking at that, improving gastric emptying, and looking at it also increasing capacity to absorb carbohydrate. So there's some good evidence around aspects of training the gut that it is important to try and build into your training plans. We're also, during the race, considering the type of carbohydrate. So again, if you're at intakes below 60 grams, if you look at the graph here, you've got, if you look from along the bottom axis, you go from kind of 10 grams up to 60 grams per hour. The blue line is the multiple transportable carbohydrate. So that basically just means you're using different types of carbohydrate as opposed to a single source of carbohydrate. Doesn't make that much difference in terms of your ability to oxidize carbohydrate. If you then go beyond that 60 grams, that's where you become limited if you're only using a single source of carbohydrate. So that's where you want to make sure that products you're using have different types of carbohydrate in them. They'll use different transporters, and therefore you can start to see that you can actually increase that amount of carbohydrate oxidation that can occur. So it can also mean that if you use different types of carbohydrate at that higher end of intakes, that you can actually get fewer gut issues as well. So something to consider is not only the amount of carbohydrate, but the type of carbohydrates that you're using as well. And most of the products now will have a mixture of kind of maltodextrin and fructose, and therefore use multiple different carbohydrates within products to enable you to take them in at higher intakes. But again, it is a bit of a trial and error to look at what works for you. Just quickly as well, these graphs just looking at, often the question asked is, what type of carbohydrate? Is it better to use drinks? Is it better to use gels? And which ones are optimal? If you look on the graph with the yellow and the green, it's comparing a sports drink ingestion and the rate of carbohydrate oxidation to using bars and water. You can see that they're slightly better from the drink towards the final end, but fairly similar in terms of the two. I guess the key thing to note there is that if you are using bars that have higher fat, contain protein, or have fiber, then that will serve to slow gastric emptying and lower that carbohydrate oxidation aspect. So it's really important to consider what bars, because there's such a wide range of bars available in terms of how you can actually cope with those at some of the higher intensities. If you then look at the graph on the right, that's looking at a difference of, in red, water and gels, and then in yellow you're looking at just using a drink. And again, there was no difference in terms of the carbohydrate oxidation from using either sports drinks or gels. And I guess just thinking about that in terms of performance and in terms of athletes that are doing events where they're using what's provided out on the course, it's really important to make sure that you trial using what's out on the course, because it can be quite different to maybe products that you've used in training. So that's something that's really critical if you're needing to rely on what's going to be provided. So then the final kind of portion is thinking about race day recovery, which can be a little bit forgotten, but is really important in terms of ensuring that you're getting that immediate post-race recovery kind of as soon as possible. So carbohydrate, protein, your fluids and electrolytes. Then thinking about your recovery meal, and I'd say probably that immediate post-race recovery is probably done better maybe than the recovery meal, because people maybe have something with them, either a bar or a drink or something that's going to start that race recovery off. But what they then forget is that needs to be followed up. And actually the best way to recover and fuel is to do it kind of over a time period, but having regular and often fueling will actually help to recover. The importance of recovery is obviously more so if your recovery time is fairly short. So if you're racing one day and you've got another event that's pretty soon after, then that's obviously going to be more critical to get recovery optimal. if you're doing a race and you want to be back training as soon as possible afterwards, again, recovering really well off the back of it will stand you in much better stead to be ready to go with training. So it is really important to get these bits right. So options to try are things like your recovery smoothies. Depending on the age of the athletes that you're working with, then you might do things like chocolate milk and banana for younger athletes. You might do some kind of a recovery drink. You might do recovery shakes for some of your other athletes. Even things like birch and muesli pots, flapjack bars and yogurt drinks, and then down to kind of your fairly standard kind of food-based options around kind of tuna chicken wraps, all sorts of things there that could be used in terms of that race recovery. And part of it is finding something that the athletes will like. They're more likely to do post-race recovery. They may not feel hungry. Most athletes don't necessarily feel hungry post-race. So finding something that they actually enjoy, look forward to, and will do is almost better than really critically making sure that it's absolutely kind of got everything they need, because you can top that up as you then go through the recovery process. So I guess just looking at where we've got to and what we've covered, is then thinking about all that information, kind of how can you make the most of that information? And I think one of the key things about race nutrition plans is you can have the best plan in the world, but if the athlete isn't actually able to kind of deliver that race nutrition plan, if there's someone that maybe forgets or doesn't find it easy to drink on the bike, or they get so engrossed in racing that they forget to take their gels on board, they're almost the more critical aspects of actually that behavior change of getting athletes to understand the importance of making sure that they've got various ways of reminding them. I know some people might set various alarms. Some people might have little notes written on their bike in terms of what they need. If you've got supporters out there, you might have someone that shouts at you on certain laps to take gels, just as a reminder if you're likely to forget. And those bits, although they sound really basic, like we have athletes that will go through a race but almost get to the last 10k and then realize that actually they pretty much haven't drunk much and they haven't taken on a gel. So it's really important that athletes kind of get into a routine, and I think the more they do it in training and those key sessions, the more it's likely to cross over into racing. So it's important that athletes not only have a kind of strategy that they've planned and they might have written down, but they also have almost ways of ensuring that they can actually execute that. And I think keeping it simple is critical to that. So I think race nutrition plans that get too complicated are probably just going to get a bit lost when you get into that race environment and there's lots of things going on, there's lots of things to consider, and it's kind of hard to keep track of what you're doing. So keeping it simple, keeping it similar to what you would do in training will generally mean that you probably execute it more often than not in a race situation. So in terms of just integrating it into training, thinking about pre-race, and this links to any level of athlete, I would say, in terms of experimenting with different breakfasts, experimenting with different meals before hard training. And you can start this from a really young age in terms of just engaging athletes with how nutrition can help support training and how that can then cross over, that they don't then have to do anything radically different in a race scenario. And the other one is just looking at, again, experimenting with taking on carbohydrate just before training, just before harder sessions, and just seeing how they feel, seeing at what point if they have any stomach issues, if they feel any different when they do it, when they don't do it, and just start to experiment with them. And it also often means that training quality around some of those key sessions can improve as well. So it's a double win from that perspective. The in-race side of things, again, we talked around and highlighted that there's an aspect of training the gut in that time before racing, and certainly doing that in the weeks leading up to racing is a key time. So trialing different drinks, gels, bars in training, and then gradually building up the amount and the volume that athletes can cope with I would say start small and see how they get on, and then gradually build it up to something that you think is about right from a race scenario. And then also, it's probably key to make sure that they almost try that full race fueling, because athletes might use sports drinks, they might use gels, they might use bars if they're on long rides, and just to support training in general. But it's quite different if we're then trying to look at, say, getting an athlete to try and see if they can tolerate up to those kind of 70, 90 grams of carbs per hour, is very different to taking that over, say, a 2-hour ride. So really just ramping it up to try almost that full, okay, what would you do per hour? And is this sustainable over a period of time is critical. And then similarly, a really good aspect in terms of recovery and in terms of getting them into the habit of using race recovery after hard training sessions. Not only will it benefit those hard training sessions, but it also means that just becomes second nature. It just becomes habit of what they always do. And then just starting to get athletes to plan ahead for meals and snacks that they could take for that immediate recovery time, and what that would look like, and what works for them. And I think that's a really critical time, that can be really individual in terms of how much they can cope with at that time. So I guess finally, just thinking about this whole process, hopefully some thoughts to be able to kind of make a plan, try and get athletes to think around what that plan would look like in the week, the days, and on race day itself. Experiment in training, and try different things, get them to try different things, see how they feel, then trial it in that low-key kind of race practice, then put it into delivery of a race, but then have real honest conversation in terms of a debrief and a review around, okay, what worked? Was I able to take things on when I thought I could? What were the challenges? What could we improve? And then that mixture can all go back into the plan that you had initially. So your race plan over time can evolve. You might have different aspects for different types of racing, and you can start to build up a bank of being confident that you know that whatever you're doing is going to work for you and going to enable you to just concentrate on delivering a good performance. And that's me done. I'm a little bit over time probably, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have for a few minutes at the end of this. And thank you for listening.
Perfect. Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, so if anyone who's asked a question is quite happy to stay on, then we can get those answered for you. At the start of the session, you were talking about buffering. So one of the questions was from Sarah H, just about what is buffering. If you just elaborate on that and give us a... Yeah,
so there's aspects in terms of, obviously, when you're racing and performing, that you will produce lactate, and there's certain products that you can use either acutely or chronically that you can use to help that. So there's things like sodium bicarbonate, sodium citrate, beta alanine that work in slightly different ways to enable you to kind of cope with that. The evidence around some of certainly the longer distance events within triathlon would say that isn't necessarily a big, there's not a lot of positive evidence from that perspective, I guess. It generally helps in kind of shorter duration, shorter distance events. But there could be scope that in certain short distance events where you're going to have higher levels of that really high intensity exercise, then it can help. So for some athletes it could be useful, but it's probably one of those ones where there's a little bit of a question mark from a triathlon perspective.
Okay, perfect. I'm not sure if Abigail, I think she is still with us. So she made a good question here. So she said she's heard female athletes can't really load up on glycogen stores, excuse me, I can't say the word, in the same way as male athletes can. So carb loading might be a waste of time as it's mopped up by insulin instead of saving muscles. Is this your advice too?
I think in terms of the carbohydrate loading, I think it comes down to the individual and the kind of the training load and the taper linked into racing, and it's looking at kind of I wouldn't go carbohydrate loading in its traditional sense, but I would go ensuring that athletes have good recovery and a good amount of kind of carbohydrate in those final couple of days leading into racing. So it's kind of a balance in terms of, ensuring that they've got sufficient carbohydrate, but not going to the extreme of a kind of a more traditional carbohydrate loading protocol. But it's still important, even for female athletes, to ensure that the glycogen stores, muscle and liver, are optimized pre-race.
Great. And there's one kind of on the same thread here, Mickey Davis. So is any advice for pre-diabetics? Is they generally advised to moderate their carbohydrate intake? So any advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't worked with diabetics, but I think from my perspective, it would be around kind of ensuring that, that you're managing that carbohydrate intake over the kind of the days leading into the race and not having sudden spikes in increase in carbohydrate. And I think the fact that if you would reduce training during that time period and just be able to manage carbohydrate intakes and therefore manage kind of blood glucose levels during that time, then you could do that through not suddenly spiking those increases kind of just before a race. And that's probably even more critical in terms of trialing options that work from a pre-race and a day before the race perspective. So I think probably managing those days leading into the race, and then finding something that works on race morning, that might be in terms of a bit of a slower release aspect. So something like a porridge would probably work better than maybe something like a white rice aspect.
Okay, I think probably just have a couple more. So we've got Fiki Blackwell. Sorry if I spelt your name or said your name wrong. So for long distance, would you advise a protein and fat intake on the bike or carbs only?
Generally, most of the time it would in a race scenario, the carbohydrate is going to be the key aspect. For some people, including if they can tolerate it, including a small element of protein can be supportive. And again, it comes down to what individual athletes can tolerate and the length of time of the race. So depending how long that race is going to be, you might add some. And if you are going to add anything additional, I'd say you would add that early on in the bike component, when the gut is more tolerant. When you get more fatigued, then adding that in is probably going to cause more challenges than the benefit that you would get. But again, probably comes down to an individual basis in terms of what you can tolerate. The carbohydrate is going to be the key one, and then if you can tolerate some of the additional things, probably more just for an Ironman as opposed to a 70.3.
Perfect. And our last one, actually, that's just come in, is quite an interesting one. So vegetarians, from Brian, fibrous food and bloating, just put down, carbohydrate pre-race, etc. All best proteins. Or Brian, are you still with us? Did you want to unmute and elaborate on your question?
Yeah, still with you guys. Yeah, basically, it's the whole package with vegetarians, isn't it? After Total Ideas, obviously they use a lot of cabbage-based organic carbos, things like that, and they just suffer a lot with flatulence and gas and things like that, and they just can't get the pre-race. And then afterwards, we hear of the pea proteins and things like this. Is there various quantities and things they need to do to sort of build up and make sure they can recover faster? Help.
Yeah, I think, certainly pre-race, making sure that you don't go too heavy, like you say, on a lot of the higher proteins. If you're using kind of beans and pulses and lentils and things like that, are going to cause a lot more of that bloating and a lot more issues around racing. So probably limiting those aspects of it, for sure. and just trying to modify that. I guess it depends what they can tolerate. If they're vegetarians and they can tolerate some of the dairy aspect, then you might stick to using some of the, like your Greek yogurt side of things. You might use more, say, of your corn and things like that. And then post race, it's whether they can cope with something like a soy recovery, which seems to sit quite well, even with people like, we have athletes that struggle with a kind of whey protein, and so they would use a soy protein as part of their kind of post-race recovery because they find less symptoms from that perspective. So there are options around that would probably be, more advisable than and trying to decrease the fiber aspect in that, certainly in that pre-race aspect. And the stomach will be more sensitive immediately post. So you might struggle in that immediately post, but then can probably revert back to it once the stomach's settled down post-race.
That's perfect.
Does that help?
It's perfect, yeah, because the soya option at the end, yeah, brilliant. And that explains why so she has real problems with it. But I was thinking in terms of the pre, you mentioned earlier, sorry about this, guys,
That's okay.
making sure she was totally recovered pre her races, and that was the problem. So she's the week prior to races and things like this, she's really loading up on those carbs, just finding going into the races she just can't. But what you've said, really good advice to minimize that, so thank you. Yeah,
no, that's pleasure.
Perfect, thank you, Brian. So there is a couple more that's come in, but I'm just conscious of time. So what I'll probably do is collate these questions, Lucy, if that's okay with you, and then get you to
you can just send them over and I can reply.
Yeah, we'll do that. Brilliant. Okay, so I just wanted to thank you for your time and doing a fantastic session. I hope that everybody found that useful. I know I've got some great takeaways to take away from that in my own race strategies and stuff like that going post-COVID. So that's been really, really useful. I just want to sign off on the last slide of the day. So just continue to share your social media experiences. Your experience on social media using the hashtag Big Reboot. So we are doing more sessions between now and Thursday. So tomorrow there are 4 more sessions. You'll have an email about this with the joining link. So we've got a drop-in session at 6 with our presenting partner Yellow Jersey, 6:30 till 9. Managing challenging behaviour with Chris Roberts. Another session at 6:30 till 7:30 on social media. And 7:45 to 8:30 is being COVID secure with our own technical manager, Gareth Barker. So if you want to join any of those sessions, then do look for the email and the links will be in there. Tell us what you think. So you should receive an email to share your feedback. So that's always welcome. And you'll also receive an email just looking out for your virtual goodie bag, which is some great discounts from our partners, bringing you special offers, and also a free t-shirt that you'll be able to get from the Big Reboot. And anything, if you've got any unanswered questions around anything to do with this conference at all, just either contact us at coaching@britishtriathlon.org or clubs@britishtriathlon.org. And I think that is it. All right. So, yeah, thank you all again for attending. I hope you enjoyed it, and we hope to see you later on in the week.